Probably the first question that I'm asked when I'm recruiting a role would be, is it hybrid? That is the first question before I'm asked about salary. I think sometimes there is a lack of understanding around that if you don't offer that, you are actually reducing your candidate pool by quite a large amount.
Welcome to In the Black. I'm Adrienne Biscontin, External Affairs Advisor at CPA Australia. Salary remains the biggest reason Australians change jobs, but the latest Hayes Salary Guide shows it's no longer the only factor shaping career decisions. Career progression, flexibility, workplace culture, and AI are all playing an increasingly important role. So, what do today's employees really want? Where are the skill shortages still emerging, and what does it all mean for accounting and finance professionals? Joining us is John Summers, Business Director for Accountancy and Finance at Hayes. We'll unpack the key findings from the 2026 Hayes Salary Guide and explore what they mean for employers and professionals in the year ahead. John, welcome to In the Black.
Thanks, Adrienne. Great to be here.
So let's start, John, by what are the standout findings for the 2026 Hayes Salary Guide, and what do they tell us about the state of Australia's labour market?
So the Australian labour market remains relatively resilient, but it is characterised by high talent mobility, some skills shortages, and a growing demand for career progression within a workforce that is rapidly embracing AI adoption as well.
Right. That's interesting. So salary remains one of the key reasons that people change jobs in Australia, but career progression is also becoming just as important. What does that tell us about changing employee expectations and behaviour, and how should employers respond?
Yeah, look, salary does remain probably the biggest driver, but it's not as clear-cut as perhaps it would have been in the past. That there are other things that are equally as important now. So, within the salary guide, for example, we found that 36% of employees were actively looking, with 34% being open to opportunities. So that's 70% that have actually been looking and that are actually open to new roles. But 43% cited better pay and 36% cited lack of progression or lack of opportunity. So I think that shows that it's no longer just around salary, but there is a real drive now for accountants, for example, to push on and grow their careers as much as salary is still important.
That's interesting, isn't it? It's 2/3 of the market have one eye on the market at any one time.
Yeah, and look, that is quite common. Obviously that's something that we speak to a lot of people on a daily basis, and you do tend to find that although some may not be actively looking, they're what we would call passively looking. So if the right opportunity came up, they would absolutely consider it. And there is varying reasons for that. It's not necessarily that someone's not happy, but that we can unpack that, as we go on.
Flexibility now seems to be an expectation rather than a differentiator as it would have once been. In a competitive talent market, what are organisations doing well when it comes to attracting and retaining people, with flexibility being one of them?
Yeah, look, I mean, flexibility, you're right. It's more an expectation now. It used to be like a unique selling point, but it's probably the first question that I'm asked when I'm recruiting a role would be, is it hybrid?
Is that right?
How many days in the office? It's more often than not, that is the first question before I'm asked about salary.
There you go.
So I think just the work landscape has kind of changed a bit from that perspective, where what we see now is people are really big on flexibility. And that means different things to different people, right? So it could mean hybrid working model with 3 days in the office or 2 days at home, or it could just mean the ability to drop the kids at school, do pick up, and just kind of have that real flexibility.
Flexibility of hours as well as days.
Of hours as well as days. But there is definitely, I find it really difficult to recruit a role if it was 5 days in the office, for example, compared to if it was hybrid.
Yes, it seems those days are long behind us.
Yeah, definitely. And I think employers need to be aware of that. I think sometimes there is a lack of understanding around that if you don't offer that, you are actually reducing your candidate pool by quite a large amount these days. So
What other things are they doing well to attract and retain people, as well as flexibility?
yeah, I think as I mentioned, career progression and having a genuine career development plan, and genuine, options that are obvious to people when they're working. So a lot of people do leave or a company because they don't see the obvious career development. Whereas if it's clearly laid out and you've got a clear development plan that someone can follow, they'll say, if I do this, I know I can get to this level. That significantly increases retention within the business. Whereas if someone doesn't have that, they may think they have to move externally to get it. And that's why we do see, a lot of people, 4 years is now, that's a long time from what I can see at the moment. So
Yeah, no longer is the 20-year gold watch
the,
something to
no,
aspire
well, I
to.
mean, this is year 14 for me at Hayes. So, I don't see a lot of that in the candidates that I speak to, but yeah, different times.
The report highlights ongoing skills shortages alongside growing use of AI in the workplace. How are these trends reshaping workforce planning and talent development?
Yeah, look, I think AI is a big one. So within the salary guide survey, what we found that 60% of employees were using AI, but only 22% had actual formal training on it. So there's definitely a gap between what employers are looking for compared to what employees are offering. And ultimately, with AI, it's something that if you don't learn how to use it and use it properly, whether it's in an accounting role or something else, then, there is a chance, you will be left behind and you'll be doing a lot more work than you probably have to.
That's interesting. I wonder if it's something that employers need to start looking at differently, how they're using AI in their workplaces and how they make that a part of the job that they're recruiting for.
Definitely, yeah. Look, it's one of those things that is such a big assistance to productivity, right? So if you're not utilizing it well, you're actually decreasing the productivity of your workforce. So I think organizations that actually embrace AI and actually pioneer it, like there's certain AI projects that we do within Hayes, for example, and that's something that is really a massive push for us, and I'm sure it's a massive should be a massive push for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, for sure. So, turning to accounting and finance industries specifically, what are you seeing in terms of talent demand and salary growth and the skills associated with that sector?
Yeah, look, so what came out of the salary guide was that there wasn't necessarily as large a skills gap in accountancy than there was within the general broader market, but we're only talking by 3%. It was 82% in the general market and 79% in accounting. So still really high.
Yeah.
But it definitely does vary depending on what the roles are and what the level are. For example, professional practice, it is still very difficult for a lot of accountancy firms to find talent. That's a really highly competitive, skills short market. And it was already skills short before the lack of training that maybe occurred a bit during COVID. So that's really feeling the impact. Um,
So, what sort of numbers are we talking about in skill shortages in that sector in public practice, accountants, and finance? We have seen it. We have seen skill shortages in the public practice sector and accounting and finance more broadly. And it's something we talk about at CPA Australia as well, the
yeah,
skill shortages and fostering the pipeline. What do you see in that in the salary guide there?
yeah. Look, it's definitely showed that the salaries within that area have increased, and that is just, I guess, natural when there is a competitive market and there's a war for talent essentially. Then that does drive salaries up. Maybe only by 3 or 4%, but it still does go up. But that technical accounting background is really important, and that's something that although there is a huge demand for business partnering and commercial analysis and those real kind of stakeholder engagement type roles, they're obviously, very important now. They're still having that real technical grounding and that, CPA qualification, for example, within a firm is still very attractive.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
So Looking ahead, what should employers and accounting and finance professionals be paying close attention to over the next 12 months in terms of trends?
Yeah, look, I think employers in accounting are realizing that pay alone is not going to be enough to attract and retain the best talent.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, it was over 30% of people did put that as their main priority. But career progression being almost as important and flexibility, being almost non-negotiable now. I think if you are offering a package with all of those things, so good remuneration, attractive remuneration doesn't necessarily have to be market leading, but if you're offering a career development plan alongside that, genuine progression, access to AI tools and flexibility, then you would position yourself as an employer of choice in the market. I think offering a real benefits package is important for employers now. So it could be extra annual leave, additional super, health insurance, things like that. Because what we have now is a workforce that is very focused on health and well-being and work-life balance, much more so than perhaps 10 years ago and beyond. So I think if you can offer things like that, then it does really set you apart.
Yeah, as a whole package to
Yeah,
attract people. So,
yeah,
so you think these are the sort of trends that employers should be focusing on in the next 12 months?
yeah. Salary, flexibility, health and well-being, genuine career progression. I think that package will help you attract the right talent.
Certainly sounds good. Which accounting and finance roles are changing most rapidly as AI and automation become more embedded in the workforce?
There is always the risk with AI that, perhaps the more junior processing type roles would be more at risk. But to be honest, I don't think it's at the level yet where we've seen that become a huge issue. We are still busy in those markets so I think if anything, it's been able to use it to enhance what you're doing at the moment. So if it's like a commercial finance role, a finance business partnering role, these tools are excellent. But I just think for any accountant, who wants to kind of develop their career, you want to make sure that you're up to date with AI and you're, taking steps. If your employer's not offering it, you could be taking steps, outside of that to do it personally. It could be through, CPA might be offering things like that, for example. So it's definitely something that, I would really encourage, candidates
Concentrate on
to
your own
concentrate.
development in that
Yeah,
sector.
yeah. Or you might be left behind.
So, John, just turning to accounting and finance sector specifically, what are some of the tips that you have in your experience that accounting and finance professionals can do?
Yeah, look, I think the biggest thing now, with AI kind of automating routine tasks, the most valuable professionals will be the ones that can combine that technical accounting experience with commercial insights, the ability to interpret data and add to decision making. Those will be the candidates that, will be able to secure those kind of, bigger roles in the future that,
So, human skills and technical
yeah, being
skills.
able to influence, is really important. I think that the biggest career opportunity for accountants that we see at the moment would be, you know, move closer to decision making, move as close to decision making as you can.
For clients. And would that be right across the career? I mean, what about mid career if you've been, in the sector for quite a while? Have you got any tips for those people?
Yeah,
Do they retrain? Do they
definitely.
look at AI development? Do they look at
Yeah.
other tools they can learn?
I could probably break it down. If someone's just qualified, for example, so if we look at them first, the strongest opportunities for those candidates that have just qualified that probably have a really strong technical grounding already and would be trying get experience with, the commercial insights piece and the analytical piece, because we do see a lot of those candidates that come through. They don't necessarily want to go into a financial accounting role. They want to go straight from perhaps audit or something similar into a business partnering role. So, I think gaining experience within financial planning and analysis, commercial analysis, and finance business partnering, even systems accounting, all of that can really stand you in good stead for, your career going forward. I think in mid-career, so a lot of those candidates already may have the commercial skills, they may have the business partnering skills, but I think there is ways to still progress to, maybe a more senior finance business partner or a commercial finance manager. And I think, being able to translate the data into real insights is something that those candidates already do well. But, AI could really help drive that forward. So it's important that they're embracing the tools that they have at their disposal.
Yes. Look at new tools and then look at
Yeah.
ongoing learning and see if there's interesting ways out there for you to learn and develop those skills.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with senior, senior leaders, those who are already perhaps in a financial control or CFO role, for example, for them, it's not about embracing change. It's often about leading change. But if so you need to make sure that you absolutely understand, because there's a chance you will be leading and driving these change initiatives that involve the systems and the AI side of things. So it's really important that you stay relevant and you stay up to speed with it.
So looking ahead, what should employers and accounting and finance professionals be paying close attention to over the next 12 months?
Yeah, look, salary pressure is creating a bit of a retention risk at the moment. It's no secret that, things are tough with inflation and everything at the
Cost of
moment.
living
Cost of living
pressures.
pressures. So, I think within the salary guide, salaries did go up, but it was a very modest increase, 4%. Half of all employees feel underpaid. 42% were satisfied. So that's more than half actually feel underpaid. And wage growth is just failing to keep up with the cost of living increases at the moment.
So it's clear that while salary remains important, employers are increasingly looking at career growth, flexibility, skills development, and opportunities to work with new technologies like AI, as we've discussed. For employers, attracting and retaining talent now requires much more than a competitive pay packet. Thanks, John, for joining us today and for sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me.
And for accounting and finance professionals, the message is clear. Continue building your technical expertise, embrace new technologies, and develop the commercial and advisory skills that are increasingly in demand. If you'd like to explore the findings in more detail, you can access the Hays Salary Guide 2026 via the link in our show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your colleagues and friends in the business community. Until next time, thanks for listening.